In the country of Fulton, Alabama, it was 1805, and in a log cabin lived a family who owned over 50 acres of land that they farmed. Now, this family had only one child, and that was special. He could see ghosts, spirits, and such. He was just like his father, who has the same gift. And this can only be passed down from generation to generation, and it was only passed down to the males in the family. The little boy, only 5 years old, didn't know he had a gift, and his father hadn't told him yet because he was waiting until he came of age. Normally, the gift doesn't truly show its full self until that male who has the gift reaches the age of 16. The boy's father got his gift at the age of 16, and it's quite odd that his son got it so early. However, he knew of his relatives before getting their gifts at an early age. About 3 miles down the road lived the boy's grandparents, who also had a farm that was twice as big as his father's, except he owned farm animals and milk, eggs, cheese, and sheep's wool at the local farmer's market in town, which was about a 10-minute horse and wagon ride. The boy's grandfather inherited the farm from his father upon his death, and his son would also inherit it after his death. Now the boy's grandfather, whom the boy Benji called Granddaddy, was very close, and he taught his grandson how to milk cows, goats, and even sheep. He even taught the boy how to shear them. The boy loved the farm and often spent his days with the animals, talking to them as he mucked out their stalls. He often spent days at a time with his grandparents. He helped his grandmother bake, which he loved. He learned how to bake bread, pies, cakes, and cookies. But what Benji loved the most was cooking with his grandmother. She was the kindest, most loving, patient woman on earth, and everything she did, she put extra love into it. After spending a day with his grandparents, sadly, it was time for Benji to go back home. So Benji and his grandfather took his horse and pulled, putting his grandson on the horse first, and he pulled himself up and sat behind Benji, and they rode back to his house. After talking with his family for a bit, the grandfather left and headed back home to finish the day's chores. He was getting the milk, cheese, and sheep's wool ready for the farmer's market in the morning. After a long night's sleep, the grandfather woke up early and had gone off to the farmer's market. He packed everything he needed into the wagon and had driven off. After a long day of being at the farmer's market, the grandfather was happy with what he made and had headed back home. He was driving along the road when, all of a sudden, a masked robber rode beside him on his horse and was holding a gun to the grandfather. He made the grandfather give the money and then shot him point blank. The grandfather fell off the wagon and the horse ran off, scared out of its wits. The robber then dragged the grandfather's bloody body into the woods, hid it behind a tree, and covered the body in leaves. When the horse returned to the farm empty, the grandfather's wife was scared and took a horse from the berth and rode it to her daughter-in-law's houses. When she got there, she was so distraught from crying that it took an hour to calm her down. "Now, mother, tell me what's wrong?" the daughter-in-law asked. "Granddaddy left for the market this morning and didn't return, and the horse came alone, and the wagon was empty." "Okay," Bessie said it calmly. "Now, is it possible that father had made a side trip somewhere and forgot to tell you? You know, he often makes unscheduled stops at the general store," Bessie suggested. "Oh, maybe," Mother answered. "This feels different. It's not sticking right with my stomach." "Mother," answered Bessie, "something's off, dear." "Okay, how about you stay here with Benji and me, and Henry will go and look for his father?" "Okay," she said it in a small, sad voice. Her face was tear-stained, and her eyes were red and bloodshot. "Try not to mention this, Benji." "Mother, okay." Bessie replied. "Okay." Mother agreed. She got up and made herself a pot of tea, and she sat with her grandson. Benji was sitting outside playing in the field when he stumbled on some old arrowheads which he dug up when playing. The little boy felt something strange, and he turned slowly, and there behind him stood his granddaddy watching him. "Granddaddy?" he yelled excitedly as he ran up to hug his grandfather. But his grandfather looked different. He felt different. He smelled different. He looked ghastly. He was cold to the touch, and Benji could see right through him. Mammy's granddaddy is here. He's here now." Mammy heard yelling and had come outside and ran to him, but his grandfather disappeared. "Benji." Mammy said, "No one is out here but us, and your grandfather hasn't returned from the market yet." "But Mammy," Benji said, tugging on his grandmother's dress, "he was here, I swear." "Now, Benji, his grandmother firmly told you not to fib," she said, wagging her finger at him. "Okay," he said, and sighed with his head down. He ran back into the field to play. Henry and his wife grabbed a horse from the barn and hitched it to a wagon, and they left. They went to gather the cousins that lived in the area, and they formed a search party. The first place they looked was the farmer's market, asking everyone who was there if they saw Granddaddy. They said he was here and left about 4 ago, and that someone who was leaving had seen him last on the road heading home. A neighbor who was out farming claimed to see a masked robber on a horse hold an old man at gunpoint, and he heard a gunshot. He saw the man take money from the old man and saw him drag him into the woods. The family searched and went down the road and followed the wagon tracks. They got out of the wagon and looked closely at the ground and were surprised to see another set of hoof tracks beside the wagon, and it looked like Granddaddy's wagon had veered off the road and tipped over. But that wasn't all. There were droplets of blood, and there was a trail of it. The family followed the trail of blood that led into the woods and stopped behind a big oak tree, and there was a lump of something that was covered up by leaves. They began removing the leaves, and much to their surprise, they found Granddaddy he'd been shot, and he bled out. Henry cried, and his wife consoled him and hugged him tightly. As he pulled away from his wife, he saw his father standing on the road, waving at him and smiling. They carefully picked up his father's body and carried it to the wagon, and they rode back to his dad's farm, where they left him in the barn and covered him until the funeral. After they were done, they dropped off the cousins and rode back to the house, where they would tell his grandmother the news. Mammy was in the kitchen cooking supper and watched Benji as he played in the field closest to the house. She missed her husband. So little did she know that her husband was in the kitchen with her. He was behind her with his hands on her shoulders, trying so hard to console her. She just stood there and cried. She heard the horse and wagon come down the drive and watched them go into the barn. She came and told them that supper was ready. She asked if they found Granddaddy, and they shook their heads yes, not knowing what to say. "Is he alive?" Mammy asked. Bessie shook her head and said, "I'm so sorry, Mother. What happened?" she demanded. Granddaddy was shot, and I don't know why. Some neighbors claim to see a robber hold Granddaddy at gunpoint, and he shot and robbed him, then drug his body into the woods. That's where we found Granddaddy. Just then, Benji came. He had been standing there listening to the whole conversation. "Granddaddy is dead?" "No." He screamed and yelled and cried and ran into the house and up to his room, but he saw his Granddaddy earlier today. How was that possible if he was dead? Just then, his father came up. Benji. His father spoke in a firm, father-like voice. "Yes, Papa? We have to talk, son. There is something I have been meaning to tell you." Benji sat up and wiped the tears and snot from his face. "You see, son, in our family, we are incredibly special, and there is a gift that has been passed down from generation to generation, and we can see ghosts, spirits, and even other things. Can I tell you a secret? It's just between you and me, son, okay?" The boy shook his head. "I saw Granddaddy today. He was on the road, and he was waving and smiling at me. Now, son, did he come and see you today?" "Yes, Papa. I was playing in the fields, digging up arrowheads, and his was right behind me. I ran up and hugged him. He felt and looked different. Those arrowheads you found were Granddaddy's. He took them and buried them in the fields when he was a child, as did his father before him. You see, son, before this was our house and land, it belonged to Granddaddy, and he gave me and your mom a wedding gift. Granddaddy wants you to have those arrowheads, so you'll have something to remember him by. And son, you meant to find those arrowheads. I'm so happy you got to see Grandpa and that you got your gift early. You see, son, I didn't get my gift until I was 16. Do Mama and Mammy know about our gift?" His father paused for a moment. "Yes and no, and neither one of them likes to talk about it." "Why?" his father queried. "I tried telling Mammy, but she didn't believe me. She thought I was telling a fib. I'm sorry, son. Your Mammy is grieving right now, and she is hurting. Do the girls in our family have our gift too?" The son was questioned. "No, son. Only the men in our family have our gift. Some of my cousins do, and I bet they saw Grandpa just like we did. Is our gift bad?" "Oh no, son, not at all," his father answered. "It's kind of neat to see things like we can. Let's get you to bed. We have a busy day tomorrow. We have a funeral to plan." "Okay, Papa. Good night." "Good night, son." The boy's father held him tight and told him that he loved him. The next morning, they all drove to the grandfather's farm and prepared for a funeral. Bessie's cousin brought flowers from her garden. Her other cousin brought a casket that he had handmade, and the other cousins made food and brought it. Everyone met at the local church for a nice service and buried the grandfather in the local cemetery. About a year later, after Granddaddy's death, the masked robber appeared again as he moved through town, killing and robbing people. There's a ghost story that the robber died mysteriously, that he was supposedly killed by Granddaddy himself, and that the robber was stabbed to death and then trampled on by a horse. When they found his body, it was bloody and mangled. It was barely recognizable, and the look on his face looked like he was frozen in fear. They claimed that Granddaddy was getting revenge for his death and trying to get justice.
Yeah.